Now it's pretty apparent that that nobody's watching the hen house, and because nobody's watching the hen house, now the fox has done got inside the hen house and is destroying the hens, destroying the chicken coop. Once more, it's not the big fox that spoils the vines necessarily. It's the little things that we allow to creep in that eventually will completely destroy the vineyard. If no one is concerned about the vineyard, and I'm using the vineyard as part of the church. If no one is concerned about the church, or no one is concerned about the vineyard, then the vineyard gets trampled upon. The church gets trampled upon. Once more, what has allowed for these things to escalate and to turn into what that they have turned into has been basically the preachers and the politicians in the past 25, 30 years here in America that kept compromising, kept watering down the message, and even though they go to church and they convince one another, well, God's a God of love, and Jesus said that whosoever comes to me shall not be denied, they stand upon to these two or three different principles out of the Bible, but yet now they know that prostitution and drug abuse and people breaking the law and all kinds of other corruption that is going on throughout the circuit is going on, and no one is willing to do nothing about it. Why? Why? Because the salt has lost its potency. And the crowds don't want to go to those that are preaching the truth pertaining to righteousness and holiness. The crowds rather go to listen to those that are telling the lies, telling the fables, telling one another, oh, it's okay if you sleep with John Doe's wife. She's been known of sleeping with several men, or vice versa. It's okay to be a homosexual. It's okay to be a lesbian, knowing good and well that the Bible contradicts that. The Bible pertaining to the King James Version Bible contradicts those things. Now, are you going to go on a rampage towards doing like they done during the Dark Ages and go around burning the Bibles? Because whenever you do that, that's whenever God will put an end to society as consciously as we know society as it being, and that's whenever great wrath, great retribution will fall upon to the planet from the heavens, and that's whenever God will destroy this planet. And he'll destroy humanity in doing so. And there'll be no ifs, ands, buts about it. Keep on keeping on. And we'll see more fires, more hurricanes, more floods. We'll see more radical weather events such as mankind has never seen. We'll see more garbage coming from various politicians. We'll see more of our children be destroyed because they become exposed to this type of disease. And the next thing you know, because our children has been exposed, now they become contaminated. Now they become that in which what they have watched or observed. That's the reason why it is critical to keep the fox out of the vineyard, regardless whether it be the big fox or the little fox. Somebody has not been watching the hen house. And now the fox is in the chicken coop. And now the chicken coop is being violated by the fox. And I'm using the chicken coop as the church. The church in general is being violated because now all this garbage has come seeping in to the point that preachers are too scared, most of them are too scared to preach the truth, because if they do, they're afraid that the congregation is going to run them out the door and run them down the road, and they'll be looking for a job somewhere else. because people don't want to hear the truth. They rather hear some sort of fictitious lie, living in la la land. You know, we talk about fake news. Well, fake news is kind of like the drug addiction over here in America. Whenever Mexico spoke up about the drug addiction and said, well, if you didn't have such of an appetite for the drugs, maybe there wouldn't be a drug problem coming from Mexico. The same way with the fake news. Whenever you have an appetite of people that want to be lied to, they want to hear the fake stuff, they want to hear the stuff that's not true, then you're going to have a supplier out there that's supplying that to a certain group of people because that's what they want to hear. They don't want to hear the truth. They rather hear a lie because their whole lives is surrounding a lie. Or maybe not their whole life, but a great deal of their lives is surrounding a lie. And because of it, now it has creeped in. It has creeped into not only our churches, but it has creeped into our courtrooms, and it has creeped into these social media platforms. Like I said, I don't blame the platform itself. I blame who is governed the platform, such as Mark Zuckerberg.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand that. Did you say you have been able to tweet?
No, we have labeled the tweets that would indicate a different result in the election, called by multiple sources.
I see. At what point was that done?
Throughout the period, October 11th to up till today.
So when the tweet was initially came in, how long was it before you, quote, updated it?
We didn't update it. We put a label on it, pointing to the broader conversation. Our goal is to connect people with more information around what's happening with the election, and that was that occurred anywhere from 5 minutes to 30 minutes, but as quickly as we can.
Thank you. Is 30 minutes the maximum time?
I don't know. We can get you that information.
Would you? I'm interested in this. Does misinformation about the results of an election and voter fraud relate to civic integrity? Why or why not?
Yes, it does. And we also label those tweets that would indicate whether fraud is happening. And again, we connect those to larger conversations on the platform. So we want to provide context here. That is our goal, providing more context, providing more information.
Okay, now a specific question, and I'm not sure actually what the answer to this should be, but on November 7th, President Trump tweeted, and I quote, "I won this election by a lot," end quote. Obviously, that's not true. President Trump lost the election. The warning label that Twitter has applied to the tweet says, and I quote, "Official sources may not have called the race when this was tweeted," end quote. Do you believe that label goes far enough to prevent the tweet's harms when the tweet is still visible and not accurate?
I do, because it's not just the surface level label. It points to a collection of news articles, of information and conversation that gives you an expansion on what's happening with the election.
I guess you see, my concerns are that these tweets arouse people. And it seems to me that the entity that...
It's not the tweak that's arousing the people. It's who is manufacturing the tweak. Okay? It's Donald Trump all along that has been flaming the fire. I have said this before in some of my other work. I'll say it again. Donald Trump has taken on Jerry Springer tactics towards getting a group of people all hyped up the same way that Jerry Springer done up in Chicago, because I had a niece that was working in behind the scenes with Jerry Springer that made, I don't know, several $1 million. Jerry Springer did. I don't know what kind of money she was making. I'm pretty sure it was good money in the camera business towards doing what they was doing. But it was wrong in how that Jerry Springer was getting in behind the ill will of sorrow and taking people's hardship and glorifying their hardship with more bad behavior. I had never seen anything like that before whenever the Jerry Springer show come on TV. Once more, no one contradicted or tried to stop Jerry Springer. And that disease spread. That influence spread. That way of life spread. And it was a bad way of life towards making fun of other people's misery and other people's sorrow. But for some reason, Jerry Springer must have thought that this is cool and fine and dandy, unconsciously like, towards doing this to people, because it's very, very cruel, it's very, very mean-spirited, and it's wrong. It's wrong to do people that way. Donald Trump has gotten on the same bandwagon, using these same type of tactics in hyping the people up by using false, fake narratives. In other words, if Donald Trump says it enough, eventually there'll be somebody out there that will listen to it, because Donald Trump has a microphone speaking to about, I believe the quote that I'm fixing to quote you is correct, to about 20 million people at any given time that he decides that he wants to say something to the national public. Well, whenever you have a microphone that big, 20 million people, can you imagine being in a coliseum and there being 20 million people wanting to hear what you have to say at the same time on a live audience? They don't make a coliseum that big. They only make a coliseum, I think, as big as a coliseum can hold, is about, the way that I understand it, is about 250,000, maybe 400,000, which is give or take about 500,000 people. Could you imagine being in a coliseum with 20 million people wanting to hear what you had to say at one time? Well, that's what Donald Trump has. He has a microphone that will reach 20 million people inside their homes, inside their cars, inside their bathrooms, inside their living rooms, outside on a lake, out on a playground, in a college, on a university, in a hospital. Donald Trump has this ability to reach 20 million people just by opening up his mic. Whenever you have this type of influence and this type of power using this type of platform, you can initiate brainwashing tactics and basically probably tell somebody that if they went outside and ate dirt, it would taste good, and eventually somebody would go out and eat dirt to see if it tasted good. Because you're dealing with such of a large audience. There would be somebody in that 20 million people that would go out and literally want to taste dirt because Donald Trump said it tasted good. They claim that Bill Clinton had the capability in using his type of tactics, that he could convince you that you could go out and buy a rotten watermelon and it would taste good before you got it to the house. These type of silver talkers that can do this are very, very persuasive. The same as Jim Jones that persuaded the people of drinking cyanide, poisonous Kool-Aid, to their very deaths. The same way as people like David Koresh, and other occult leaders here in America and throughout the world have notably done in persuading flocks of people, groups of people, in doing stuff that was unethical, illegal, and in the eyes of the King James Version Bible was immoral. Which, if I'm talking about the King James Version Bible, ordinarily I'm talking about the holy, righteous God, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of all the other holy prophets in the Bible. There has to be some way of governing bad behavior on these type of platforms, because it's no longer considered a communication device. It's actually a tool that can be used for good purposes, or a tool that can be used as a bad purpose. And of course, if you want to use the tool as a bad purpose, then it no longer is considered a tool, but now it's considered a weapon. You have weaponized your documentation device. Because now you're spreading the poison. Kind of like Jerry Springer, that started out with a viewing crew of about, I think they said about 5,000, and there at the last, over several million people that would view his show every day, because his show kept expanding and kept expanding and kept expanding, and more news networks wanted to broadcast his message, and they was actually paying him for that type of entertainment. And that's how they looked at it. They looked at it as it being entertainment. Entertainment towards laughing at somebody else's misery. Being entertained by somebody else's sorrow and somebody else's pity. That's how the general public was looking at that. Once more, why? Because the salt had lost its savor. It has lost its potency. And people was no longer concerned about the little fox. Well, now the little fox has obviously spoiled the vineyard. And that's where we are towards trying to straighten out this mess that various institutions and various pillars of society has allowed for to get out of hand. And I'm talking about the people. I'm soon to be 60 within the next 3 or 4 months. I'm talking about the people that's already in their mid to late 70s, the people that's in their 70s, and the people that's in their mid to upper 60s. These are the people that have allowed to water down the message, to water down the message, to water down the message. They rather hear fake news than they would the truth. That has allowed for this to creep up into society the way that it has. And that's another reason why that I point my finger at Tommy Moore, Judge Tommy Thomas, and other law enforcement agencies around here, because they're old enough, they're older than I am, and they're supposed to be smart enough to recognize the difference between righteousness and unrighteousness behavior, but they sat idly back and didn't care. They just wanted to rake in the dough. They wanted to remain in their high and mighty positions towards either being a chief of police or a sheriff or a lawyer or a judge or whatever. And now we're starting to see the transparency in what has went on here. And the picture is not pretty. The picture is not pretty at all towards what preachers and politicians have set idly back and allowed to come up onto society.
Ought to have an understanding that when there is a major situation, that the tweets can play a unique role in either reassuring or stirring people up to unacceptable levels. Could you comment on that?
Well, I agree in spirit. Our policy is focused on misleading information around the election and the civic process to provide greater context, to provide additive information so that people can make decisions around what's happening within the election. And that is three phases. That's the run up to the election, that's election day, and also the phase we're in right now, post-election. So our policies and enforcement are focused on providing more information, more context to people in those three phases.
Well, let me give you a specific. On November 7, President Trump tweeted this: "I won this election by a lot." End quote. That's obviously not true. President Trump lost the election. The warning label that Twitter has applied to the tweet says, and I quote, "Official sources may not have called the race when this was tweeted," end quote. Now, here's the question. Does that label do enough to prevent the tweet's harms?
They may not have, but I did, because I evaluated it. I looked at each state who had already turned in their ballots and who had not. And I done the math. And then I got down on my knees and I prayed to God. And God revealed to me what I thought was true, that there's no way that the Republican Party had won this election, because there was too many states out there that hadn't been called yet that was still being looked at in more of a Democrat victory than a Republican victory. So within an hour, I contradicted on my platform, on my YouTube platform, and you can back it up and find it, that I contradicted what the chief and commander had said to my viewers in trying to tell my people that what Donald Trump was telling you was nothing more than a bald-faced lie. I stood up to the chief and commander within an hour after the election. I think he stood up, give or take, about 2 o'clock our time. And I think maybe it was 1 o'clock, but it was an hour later, approximately an hour later, is whenever I come out with my analogy contradicting that in which what had been said by Donald Trump. Now, if that means anything to anybody, I don't know. It does to me. It means that I'm obviously plugged into the right circuit pertaining to God. I don't think somebody could had gotten lucky coincidentally, because I don't believe in coincidences, towards making this type of call. Just like I didn't think it was coincidental yesterday whenever I was putting out my material to wind up with 168 pages that I had originally originated with in 1988, while I was taking my material from paper form and putting it on audio digital data form on a cassette tape. I don't think it was coincidental of me stopping at 168 pages, of me no longer having anything to say or put on paper at that particular time of my life. Just like I don't think it was a coincidence that 168 people perished in the Oklahoma bombing. Now you can sit here and you can say, that's nothing to you, but to me, it means everything. Because I have put these pieces together in my life just like putting a puzzle together. And I know that I'm right about what I'm talking about, just like the election, just like, producing these social media platforms and nobody willing to govern it. That's been bad influences in the eyes of children and the eyes of the weak-minded people. I know what I know, and this is what I know. This is my story, and I'm sticking to it.
When the tweet is still visible and is not accurate?
I believe it's really important that we show people a broader context, and that is the intention of the label. It is not just text below a tweet. It is a link to connect to a much larger conversation and news articles across the spectrum.
Well, give me an example. What would have to happen before the situation would warrant a stronger response?
Well, we did have stronger responses during Election Day and the week after, where we did put an interstitial, meaning that you had to click through to see the content of the tweet, and it limited spread for anything that went against our civic integrity policy, including premature calls to election results.
Well, let me give you one more. On November 12th, President Trump tweeted a conspiracy theory that 2.7 million votes for him were deleted. The warning label that Twitter has applied to that tweet said, quote, "This claim about election fraud is disputed." Now, here's the question, and I think it is a tough issue. Do you believe this label does enough to prevent the tweet's harms? When the tweet is still visible, it's a highly emotional situation, but the tweet has no factual basis.
But the tweet has a link to more information, to more conversation, and more context that informs the situation, what's happening. So I do believe that connecting people to the larger conversation, giving them more context, is the right path here.
But they have to move to solicit that contact, right? It's not contained as an addendum to the original tweet.
The label is an addendum to the original tweet, and if you tap on it or click it, you will go to an expansion of the information.
I see. Can I ask a question, Mr. Zuckerberg? Is he?
Yes, you may. If you want
Thank
more,
you.
that'd be okay.
Mr. Zuckerberg, at the recent hearing before the Senate Commerce Committee, you said that Facebook has a, quote, policy in place that prevents any candidate, end quote, from, quote, trying to delegitimize the result of the election, end quote. But the hashtags steal the vote and voter fraud garnered more than 300,000 interactions on your platform in the hours after Mr. Trump falsely declared victory. So here's the question. Do you believe Facebook did enough to prevent Trump's efforts to delegitimize the election result? If so, why have you reached that conclusion?
Good question.
Senator, I believe that we've taken some very significant steps in this area. Not just the adding additional context to specific posts and making it so that when people search for different hashtags, we show additional information. But we also took the unprecedented step of putting the Voter Information Center at the top of Facebook and Instagram for everyone in the U.S. that showed them reliable information about the election, including partnering with organizations like Reuters and the National Election Pool to show them accurate information about the results of the election. So all taken together, I think that we really went quite far in terms of helping to distribute reliable and accurate information about what was going on during this election.
Okay, let me give you one more along this line. After President Trump falsely claimed that the election was being stolen, a group called Stop the Steal was started on Facebook. It grew to more than 300,000 users in less than a day, making it one of the fastest growing groups, I understand, in Facebook history. You shut the group down, but substantial damage already had been done. Trump supporters, some of them armed with assault weapons, held Stop the Steal rallies outside election offices. In Philadelphia, 2 armed supporters who had traveled from Virginia were arrested on their way to the city's vote counting center. Here's the question, and this is a tough one. What are your concerns about the spread of misinformation, no matter how innocent it is, or it is not innocent, like Trump's claims about the election that they may incite violence?
Senator, I'm very worried about this, especially any misinformation or content that could incite violence. And during such a volatile period like this, one of our top priorities is making sure that people don't use our platform to organize any violence or civil unrest. And that was the basis under which we took down that group, because there were a number of members who were posting potentially violent or encouraging violent comments that violated our policies. We also have broader policies in place around trying to slow the spread of misinformation more broadly, even when it's not going to lead to some kind of violence or imminent harm. And that's why we've created this independent fact-checking program, where we work with more than 80 partners around the world to help do fact-checking, because people in our community have told us they don't want to see misinformation, but they also don't want us to be deciding what is true and false. So we've taken the step of building this program, which I believe is more sophisticated than what anyone else in our industry has. So I'm very focused on these issues.
Well, I'm happy to hear that, because I'm really struck by it, that people armed with assault weapons as a product of a tweet could rally outside an election office. And I think it's really a serious issue that needs to be considered. And there need to be, once you signal that and people respond to it, it has to be in some way abated or some way pointed out or restructured,
Delegitimized.
on the internet itself. Now, can you respond to that?
Senator Feinstein,
Sir?
I hate to, we're almost double the time. Could we?
I'm sorry.
That's all right. We're going to have a vote come up, and I apologize. Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I'd like to note that as far as the president's arguments about the election and how they turned out, inciting violence, I'd like to point out here that the only violence that I'm aware of has occurred in connection with Antifa. Antifa's response to pro-Trump peaceful rally attenders. So I don't quite understand that. Maybe we'll have a chance to dwell on that more in a minute. But first, I want to talk a little bit about federal law, existing federal law, and what it requires. Section 5 of the Federal Trade Commission Act prohibits businesses from engaging in unfair or deceptive trade practices. Compliance with this particular law requires that there be some consistency between what a company represents as their practices and their products and what they actually are. In other words, you can't sell one thing and provide another under the guise of providing something different than what's being sold. Both Twitter and Facebook represent and have represented for years to their users, their customers, that they take a neutral approach to election content moderation. However, as we've heard today, and as we will continue to hear today and into the foreseeable future, there are instances in which your platforms are taking a very distinctively partisan approach, and not a neutral one, to election-related content moderation. For example, just days before the election, Twitter suspended the account of Mark Morgan. Now, Mark Morgan is the commissioner of the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Office. And they suspended Commissioner Morgan's Twitter account, specifically for a tweet celebrating the success of the U.S. southern border wall. Apparently, Commissioner Morgan's tweet, his comments about the border wall, violated Twitter platform rules governing what it calls hateful conduct. Now, I've read the offending post, and the offending post from Commissioner Mark Morgan reads as follows. At CBP and the Army Corps of Engineers, continue to build new wall every day. Every mile helps us stop gang members, murderers, sexual predators, and drugs from entering our country. It's a fact walls work. Period, close quote. Mr. Dorsey, can you tell me in one sentence, what exactly is hateful about Commissioner Morgan's tweet that I just read?
Well, we evaluated this tweet again, and we found that we were wrong. That was a mistake, and it was due to the fact that we had heightened awareness around government accounts during this time. So that was a mistake. We reverted it.
Thank you. I appreciate that. We're going to get back to more of that in a minute and get back to the fact that, I understand that mistakes happen. But what we're going to see today is that mistakes happen a whole lot more, almost entirely on one side of the political aisle rather than the other. Now, Commissioner Morgan's statement in that tweet, as was initially taken down, is factual. There's nothing remotely hateful about it, and yet it was taken down. Now, on October 15th, Facebook relied on a third-party fact-checker's assessment to ban 2 advertisements from Facebook for, quote, partly false information. Now, both of these advertisements were factual in nature. They revealed Joe Biden's and Kamala Harris's views on late-term abortion. Joe Biden has stated that he won't accept any restrictions on abortion, and Senator Harris's views are such that she voted against requiring care for a child born alive during a botched abortion. The very next day, the third-party fact-checker issued a statement retracting the assessment and retracting it as erroneous. However, it stunningly took Facebook almost 2 more weeks until October 29th, when voting had already started in many jurisdictions, to lift the ban on these legitimate ads. Ads that the fact checker had already declared a couple weeks earlier were erroneously taken down. So, Mr. Zuckerberg, why on earth did it take Facebook 2 weeks to correct this error?
Senator, I'm not familiar with the details of us re-enabling that ad, so I can follow up with you after. It's possible that this was just a mistake or delay, and unfortunately, when we handle millions or billions of pieces of content a day, while we strive to do as well as possible and be as precise as possible, we will make some mistakes.
Thank you. I appreciate your acknowledgement of the fact that there are mistakes. As I noted previously, those mistakes sure happen a whole lot more on one side of the political spectrum than the other. Now, this is understandable. We're humans, but it's also understandable why this might occur. Maybe some of it has to do with your employees. 92.83% of Facebook employees who donated to federal candidates did get to Democrats. At Twitter, it's even more stark than that, as if it could get much more stark, but 99.3% of Twitter employees who donated to federal candidates gave to Democrats. And so these mistakes, they may be mistakes, but they're mistakes that rhyme. They may not repeat themselves, but they rhyme. And the consistent theme happens to be Republicans, conservatives, and pro-life activists. Now, I'd like to ask both of you, is there a list of every user or every content creator who has been deplatformed or had their content's reach altered or have had some other adverse action taken by either Facebook or Twitter altered? Is there some list that identifies each user for which that has happened? Mr. Zuckerberg, let's hear from you. Just a yes or no question. Does such a list exist?
Senator, I'm not aware of anything like that existing.
Mr. Dorsey, how about you?
I'm exactly sure what you're asking, but
Yeah.
we certainly.
Simple question. Do you have a list of people, your users or content creators, who have had some adverse action taken against them, either being deplatformed or having their reach altered or something because of the content of their posts?
Well, certainly whenever we take an action, it's recorded somewhere in a database, but I'm not sure if that's your intent.
That's helpful. So what I'm hearing from both of you is that while there may not be an actual list, and I'd like you both to check to see if such a list exists, But even if there isn't, there is a de facto list because you have within your databases records of occasions when this has occurred. And so I'd like to ask both of you, if such a list exists, please send it to me. I'd like to see it. If such a list does not exist, you certainly do have the data necessary in order to generate some. And I request as a member of this committee that you generate such a list and provide it to me. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Senator Graham, the chairman of the committee, has stepped out momentarily. I've been directed to recess the hearing momentarily so that we can go and vote, and then we will pick up back here in just a few minutes. I would like to, as long as I have the gavel momentarily, I'm going to ask one more question before I leave to go vote, and then we'll recess the hearing after this.
Could I ask when we're coming back? I've been waiting to ask questions for an hour now.
Yeah, we'll be coming back as soon as Senator Graham returns. He left to vote in just a moment ago. He'll be back. Mr. Zuckerberg, in September, Facebook tagged an ad run by the American Principles Project in Michigan that criticized Joe Biden and criticized Senator Gary Peters. The ad was tagged because it was quote unquote missing context. Now, the next day, the ad was shut down entirely by Facebook. Facebook relied on a supposed fact check from PolitiFact, which is a nice way for you to avoid taking accountability for the problem, except that the fact check in question literally said that the ad, quote, makes, quote, predictions we can't fact check. Apparently this had to do with lacking context. So when did lacking context become a new standard for political ads? I mean, all political ads, all ads in general, but certainly all political ads lack context. Ben Sasse just finished a resounding victory in Nebraska. And I haven't seen his TV ads, but I'm sure they're brilliant. This guy's made for television. He's with or without the beard. And I'm sure his ads didn't say, Ben Sasse, great senator, but not that great of a hockey player. Or there's always context that is left out in any advertisement. So what does that mean? And have you applied the missing context label to any Democratic ads, a single one that you can identify?
Senator, I'm not familiar with that specific standard, but as kind of a background on the fact-checking program, the basis of this is that we have heard resoundingly from our community that people do not want to see misinformation and believe that it is a problem. But people also believe that they do not want Facebook to be the arbiter of truth in deciding everything that is true and false. And for what it's worth, I strongly agree with that. And I do not think it is the right thing for us to assume that role. So within those bounds, we've tried to create a fact-checking program that works with independent third parties who've been accredited by the Poynter Institute for Journalism, which I think is widely respected. And we give those fact-checkers the latitude to determine whether ads or other content on our service is accurate, and if not, we apply some demotions or we prevent them from being run as ads. I can follow up in more detail afterwards on the specifics of your questions, since I'm not as familiar with them right now.
I would appreciate that very much if you'd be willing to do that, because it's not only inconsistent with logic and with the standards that apply in every other advertising context that I'm familiar with. It's also inconsistent with what Facebook itself does. Just to give you some context for that, while we're talking about missing context, I recently posted something about the election on Facebook. And my Facebook post was almost immediately tagged with the following, quote, election officials say that voter fraud, which is historically rare, has not affected the outcome in this election. They have confirmed that mail-in voting was conducted in accordance with state voting rules, close quote. Now, I find this a little disturbing. TAG to me sounds a whole lot more like state-run media announcing the party line rather than a neutral company, as it purports to be, running an open online forum. This kind of editorializing insulates people from the truth, and it insinuates that anyone concerned about voter fraud must be crazy. It also states it as if it were an irrefutable, neutral, objective fact. Now, maybe these kinds of concerns are out of the mainstream in Palo Alto, but they're not out of the mainstream with the rest of America. I have to reiterate, I hope this kind of manipulation wasn't intentional. But
come on.
it's getting harder and harder for me to accept the premise that it could be anything but intentional. And if it was intentional, it's yet more evidence that Facebook's actions surrounding this election are incongruent with the promises that you've made to your own users. And that's a problem. Consistent with the directions I've been given by Chairman Graham, we're now going to recess. I predict we'll be in recess for no more than 10 or 15 minutes until Chairman Graham returns. We stand in recess.
All right, you have been listening to the Senate Judiciary Committee hearing on Capitol Hill, grilling CEOs of major technology companies, including Twitter and Facebook. Jack Dorsey, Mark Zuckerberg present during this hearing. Let's bring in Molly Hemingway, senior editor at The Federalist and Fox News contributor, joining us now. Molly, I see that what you are reacting to on Twitter, ironically, while this is all happening, is Senator Lindsey Graham saying that Twitter made itself the New York Post's editor. It was quite a moment. It was near the top of the hearing where he said, if you're not the New York Post, why are you making editorial decisions? Watch this.
There are rules about what a newspaper can do. And what I want to try to find out is if you're not a newspaper at Twitter or Facebook, then why do you have editorial control over the New York Post? They decided, and maybe for a good reason, I don't know, that the New York Post articles about Hunter Biden.
And Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey went on to explain why they did what they did. What did you think of it?
Well, Jack Dorsey falsely claimed that the reason why they censored and brutally interfered in the 2020 election by censoring the New York Post, deplatforming them, restricting people's ability to share information about Hunter Biden's laptop, was because it violated their terms of service. He said their terms of service prevent anybody from sharing information that they believe to be hacked. We know that's not true in multiple ways. For one thing, there is no evidence that the Hunter Biden laptop materials were hacked. They were a legitimate journalistic inquiry for anybody who cares about journalism or facts. This was obviously something that people had a right to know, that the Biden family business was involved with the Chinese Communist Party and its state-owned businesses. There is no question that that is important, and there was also no suggestion that these were hacked materials. And then there's also the issue that we do know that there were hacked materials, which were Donald Trump's tax returns, which the New York Times didn't even bother explaining how they were able to hack, but we know that they were ill-gotten. You know, whoever shared them did not have authorization to share them. And yet Twitter made no attempt to restrict the sharing of that information. So we have evidence that Twitter and other big tech companies are lying about their involvement and their interference in the 2020 election. And we're having yet another round of hearings. It's interesting to see that Democrats who are asking the questions tend to be largely supportive of deplatforming of conservatives and censorship. That makes sense because it helped them so much in the 2020 election. And then Republicans are asking some questions about it. I think it is getting to the point, though, that a lot of people who are victims of this censorship and election interference are wondering how much more are we going to be talking about it and when will something actually be done, particularly considering how much impact these big tech censorship and deplatforming efforts have had on people's elections.
Molly, I think it's such a great point. I think the American people watch another hearing like this.
All right, let's fast forward real quick. Let's put it on this. Keep going. Keep going.
In fact, a subsidy while they become some of the wealthiest corporations on the face of the planet. Mr. Dorsey, I want to focus primarily on Twitter and ask you initially, is Twitter a publisher?
Is Twitter a publisher?
Yes.
No, we are not. We distribute information.
So what is a publisher?
An entity that is publishing under editorial guidelines and decisions.
Well, your answer happens to be contrary to the text of federal statute, particular section 230, which defines an information content provider as any person or entity that is responsible in whole or in part for the creation or development of information provided through the internet or any other interactive computer service. Let me ask you, was Twitter being a publisher when it censored the New York Post?
No, we have very clear policies on the conduct we enable on the platform. And if there's a violation, we take an enforcement action, and people choose to commit to those policies and to those terms of service.
Except your policies are applied in a partisan and selective manner. You claim it was hacked materials, and yet you didn't block the distribution of the New York Times story that alleged to talk about President Trump's tax returns, even though a federal statute makes it a crime to distribute someone's tax returns without their consent. You didn't block any of that discussion, did you?
Our policy was focused on distribution of the actual hacked materials.
Did you block the discussion of the president's tax return material?
And in the New York Times case, we interpret it as reporting about the hacked materials.
Did you block Edward Snowden when he illegally released material?
I don't have the answer to that.
The answer is no. You haven't used this in a selective manner. Let me ask you, were you being a publisher when you forced Politico, another journalistic outlet, to take down their tweets on a topic that you had deemed impermissible?
No. We were enforcing our policy and our terms of service.
So on October 15th, Jake Sherman, a reporter at Politico, tweeted the following. I tweeted a link to the New York Post story right after it dropped yesterday morning. I immediately reached out to the Biden campaign to see if they had any answer. I wish I'd given the story a closer read before tweeting it. Twitter suspended me. So you actually have a reporter reporting on a story, asking the other side for comment. And Twitter says, hi, Jake Sherman, your account at Jake Sherman has been locked for violating Twitter rules. Now, what did the Politico reporter do? Immediately tweets after that, my goal was not to spread information. Well, that's a little worrisome just in and of itself. My goal was to raise questions about the story. Oh, my overlords in Silicon Valley, I was attacking the New York Post. You don't understand, I was attacking them. As I did in subsequent tweets, and see how the Biden campaign was going to respond. They later did respond. And then, not long after, Jake Sherman comes back with, my account is clearly no longer suspended. I deleted the tweet. When Twitter is editing and censoring and silencing the New York Post, the newspaper with the fourth highest circulation in the country, and Politico, one of the leading newspapers in the country, is Twitter behaving as a publisher when it's deciding what stories reporters are allowed to write and publish and what stories they're not?
No, and that account was not suspended. It fell afoul of the hacked materials policy. We realized that there was an error in that policy and the enforcement.
Hold on, I'm literally looking at the tweet from Twitter that says your account has been locked. You're telling me that this is not an accurate...
That's a lock and can be unlocked when you delete the...
I understand that you have the star chamber power. Your answer is always, well, once we silence you, we can choose to allow you to speak. But you are engaged in publishing decisions. Let me shift to a different topic. Mr. Dorsey, does voter fraud exist?
I don't know for certain.
Are you an expert in voter fraud?
No, I'm not.
Well, why then is Twitter right now putting purported warnings on virtually any statement about voter fraud?
We're simply linking to a broader conversation so that people have more information.
No, you're not. You put up a page that says, quote, voter fraud of any kind is exceedingly rare in the United States. That's not linking to a broader conversation. That's taking a disputed policy position, and you're a publisher when you're doing that. You're entitled to take a policy position, but you don't get to pretend you're not a publisher and get a special benefit under Section 230 as a result.
That link is pointing to a broader conversation with tweets from publishers and people all around the country.
Mr. Dorsey, would the following statement violate Twitter's policies? Quote, absentee ballots remain the largest source of potential voter fraud.
I imagine that we would label it so that people can have more context.
How about this quote? Quote, third-party organizations, candidates, and political activists, voter fraud is particularly possible where, quote, third-party organizations, candidates, and political party activists are involved in, quote, handling absentee ballots. Would you flag that as potentially misleading?
I don't know the specifics of how we might enforce that, but I imagine a lot of these would have a label pointing people to a bigger conversation.
Well, you're right. You would label them because you've taken the political position right now that voter fraud doesn't exist. I would note both of those quotes come from the Carter-Baker Commission on Federal Election Reform. That is Democratic President Jimmy Carter and former Secretary of State James Baker. And Twitter's position is essentially voter fraud does not exist. Are you aware that just 2 weeks ago in the state of Texas, a woman was charged with 134 counts of election fraud? Are you aware of that?
I'm not aware of that.
If I tweeted that statement with a link to the indictment, would you put a wording on it that says, well, the Democratic Party position right now is voter fraud doesn't exist?
I don't think it's useful to get into hypotheticals, but I don't believe so.
You don't believe so? Well, we're going to test that because I'm going to tweet that and we'll see what you put on it. All right. Yesterday, Mr. Dorsey, you and I spent a considerable amount of time on the phone, and you said that you wanted to embrace transparency. So I want to ask you, I have asked Twitter, I've asked Facebook multiple times, how many times have you blocked Republican candidates for office, their tweets or their posts in 2016, in 2018, and 2020? How many times have you blocked Democratic candidates for office? How many times have you blocked Republican office holders? How many times have you blocked Democratic office holders? Twitter has repeatedly refused to answer that question with specific hard data and cataloging the examples. In the interest of transparency, which you said you want to embrace, will you commit in this hearing right now to answer those questions in writing?
And we'll exactly what we want to do.
Okay.
I'm sorry, Mr. Dorsey, I didn't hear you.
That's exactly what we're pushing for as we think about building upon 230.
Is that a yes that you will answer those questions in writing?
Transparency, not just of outcomes, but also our process as well.
Is that a yes that you will answer those questions in writing?
We'll certainly look into it and see what we can do.
And actually answer them and not give lawyerly doublespeak about why you're not going to give specifics. Answer them. Will you commit to this committee that you will answer those questions?
We're going to work to answering broader transparency around outcomes.
All right, that's a no. Mr. Zuckerberg, how about you? Will you commit that Facebook will answer those specific questions, cataloging the number of instances in which Democrats in 16, 18, and 20 have been silenced versus the number of instances in which Republicans have been silenced on Facebook?
Senator, I'm not sure if we have that data available, but I will follow up with you or your team.
Okay, I'm going to take that as a yes, and I'm going to take Twitter. We'll see if it's a yes or transparency is bogus and we don't intend to provide it.
Senator Durbin.
You know, whenever you get to looking at these types of flip-floppy answers to these flip-floppy questions, which the question itself was not flip-floppy. I think the American people deserve to know if there's more bias against the Republicans versus the Democrats, regardless whether it's Twitter, Facebook, or whoever, towards shutting down accounts. But whenever you get to looking at how that they're crawfishing and answering their questions, they're very, very cautious in how that they are either committing or not committing to what they're answering before this government official meeting in regards to this hearing, they're very, very cautious because I think they don't want to wind up sticking their foot in their mouths, and there ain't nothing that they can do towards retracting from it. Once more, it's the people that have abused this invention. Once more, I'm going to go back. I'm going to use the word invention. And it wouldn't be no different if it was the invention of running water through pipes, or the invention of electricity, or the invention of making motorized automobiles. These social media accounts are inventions. And no one has been governing the people that has been using the inventions. And because they have not been governing them, they have been abusing them. Just like selling guns. You mass produce all these guns and you put them out to society. All you're doing is asking for chaos and anarchy, especially with people's minds being like they are today towards them doing drugs, being messed up, and people not having any guilt pertaining to their consciousness of their acts one way or the other. You're creating an atmosphere of toxicity. Is it the gun manufacturer's fault because the gun manufacturer wanted to make a profit off of the guns? No. Is it the pathetic public that wanted to hoard the guns? That way they could go on a rampage one day and go to inciting violence? In a way. But in more ways, the fault falls upon the people that was supposed to have been governing the people that was out mass buying the guns to begin with. Look at, I believe it was Greenland that had a mass shooting. They immediately banded all ARs and AK-47s. Any major assault rifle, they banded it, and within a matter of a few weeks made it a law. And within a few days, if you didn't turn your rifle in, and if you was caught with this particular item, you would be serving time in jail, and God only knows at the fines that you would be paying. When we do not have an entity in America that stands up for the same thing, regardless whether it's gun laws or it's social media laws. Whenever you no longer have a entity that cares about its morals, then you have an entity running wild, such as what we have seen now for years and years and years here in America. I'm going to leave one more question with this particular senator here and see what he has to ask, because I don't want to tie this up for too long of a time. It's pretty obvious that a lot of people have dropped the ball on this. Just like it's obvious that a lot of people here in America have dropped the ball on our gun laws. And they've dropped the ball on other areas pertaining to children. And they've dropped the ball pertaining to immigrants. And they've dropped the ball as far as people abusing the system, etc., etc. But let's listen to what this one individual here has to say in his comments, and then we're going to shut her down.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We live in a dangerous world. Issues of national security, the worst pandemic, public health crisis in modern times in America, and we are being challenged as to whether there's going to be a peaceful transition of power in America in the presidency. At that moment in time, we decided none of those topics were important. And what was important was to determine whether or not social media was discriminating against Republicans. It's an interesting question. I think there are more important and timely questions. We have a recount underway in Georgia. We have allegations made by the election officials there where the Republican election officials, where they have faced literally death threats. We are trying to determine whether or not the social media instruments of America are fair to the Republican Party. I'm trying to struggle with this issue because I want to put it in a context, and maybe I can't. Maybe this is unique. We certainly know what the Constitution says when it comes to free speech, and we know what it meant over the years, New York Times versus Sullivan and others with publications. We certainly didn't suggest that anyone that used a telephone line for nefarious, illegal, banned activity somehow implicated the telephone company into it by its nature. And then came radio and TV, and we had to come up with new rules in terms of, at one time, equal time, fair content, and so forth. And now we have this relatively new mechanism of communicating information, and we're trying to determine what to do with it, whether to treat it like a newspaper publishing or treat it like some sort of a communications network alone. Section 230 is an attempt to do that, and I'm sure everybody finds fault with it. I'd like to ask the two witnesses if they would comment on the historical aspects of this particular debate, if they have any thoughts. Mr. Zuckerberg.
Senator, one of the points in the discussion that I find interesting is people ask if the regulatory model should be more like kind of the news industry or more like telcos. But from my perspective, these platforms are a new industry and should have a different regulatory model that is distinct from either of those other two. I think it is not the case that we're like a telco and that there are clearly some categories of content, whether it's terrorism or child exploitation, that people expect us to moderate and address. But we're also clearly not like a news publisher in that we don't create the content and we don't choose up front what we publish. We give people a voice to be able to publish things. So I do think that we have responsibilities, and it may make sense for there to be liability for some of the content that is on the platform. But I don't think that the analogies to these other industries that have been created previously will ever be kind of fully the right way to look at this. I think it deserves and needs its own regulatory framework to get built here.
Thank you. Would the other witness care to respond?
From a historical perspective, 230 has created so much goodness and innovation. And, if we didn't have those protections when we started Twitter 14 years ago, we could not start. And that's what we're most concerned with, is making sure that we continue to enable new companies to contribute to the internet, to contribute to conversation. And we do have to be very careful and thoughtful about changes to 230 because going one direction might box out new competitors and new startups. Going another might create a demand for an impossible amount of resources to handle it. And going yet another might encourage even more blocking of voices or what's being raised here, which is censorship of voices and changing the internet dramatically.
Go ahead.
So I believe that we can build upon 230. I think we can make sure that we're earning people's trust by encouraging more transparency around content moderation and our process of it. I think we need much more straightforward appeals. And I think the biggest point to really focus on going forward is algorithms and how they are managing and creating these experiences and being able to have choice in how to use those algorithms on platforms like ours.
Let me get into a specific, Mr. Zuckerberg. October 10th, Detroit Free Press reported 13 men charged Thursday in a conspiracy to kidnap Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer used Facebook and secure messaging apps to connect and plot their attack. The group's use of Facebook spans almost a full year. Members began to use the social media platform as a recruitment tool in November 2019, according to an affidavit by Brian Russell, Detective Sergeant, Michigan State Police. Once recruited, members communicated via a secured encrypting message platform. According to news reports, Facebook alerted the FBI about the Michigan kidnappers' online activity several months before the arrest. Thank goodness. However, in August, a Facebook page for the Kenosha Guard militia, which advocated violence in the aftermath of the shooting of Jacob Blake, was reportedly flagged over 455 times to Facebook. However, the page was deemed non-violating and left up. More than 4,000 people responded to that event. Hundreds of armed militia members showed up. A member of this group, a teenager from Illinois, later shot and killed 2 people on the streets of Kenosha. Mr. Zuckerberg, you described Facebook's handling of this militia page as an operational mistake. Can you explain the exact reason why the Kenosha militia page was not taken down?
Senator, yes. And first, what happened in Kenosha was obviously terrible. What happened here was we rolled out a strengthened policy around militia pages in general. Whereas before that, we would have allowed a group that was a militia as long as it wasn't planning or organizing violence directly. In the lead up to the election, we strengthened the policy to disallow more of those groups because we were on high alert and we're treating this situation as very volatile around potential civil unrest around the election. We just put that policy into place, and for a number of reasons, it had not yet been fully rolled out, and all of the content reviewers across the company hadn't been fully trained on that. So we made mistakes in assessing whether that group should be taken down. But upon appeal, when it was escalated to a more senior level of content review folks who have more specific expertise in these areas, we recognized that it did violate the policy, and we took it down. It was a mistake. It was certainly an issue, and we're debriefing and figuring out how we can do better. Although one other piece that I would add is that the person who carried out the shootings was not in any way connected to that page or linked to any of the content there from anything that we or others can tell.
Mr. Chairman, if I could ask one more question. Yesterday, the FBI released its annual hate crime incident report. The report found that more people were killed in hate-motivated violence in 2019 than any year since the FBI began collecting hate crime data in 1990. The report also found that race-based hate crimes remained the most common type of hate crimes last year, and documented increase in religion-based hate crimes, anti-Hispanic hate crimes, and hate crimes targeting individuals based on gender identity. Given these statistics, it appears to me that it's more important than ever for social media companies to combat hate on their platforms. And I might add to one of my colleagues who stated earlier, this is not Antifa, but these are documented hate crimes from the FBI. Muslim advocates, Muslim have reached out to you many times, Mr. Zuckerberg, about this issue relating to published content that reflects on certain religious groups. And you said at a hearing you do not allow hate crimes on Facebook. Yet in May 2020, the Tech Transparency Project found more than 100 American white supremacist groups, many of them explicitly anti-Muslim, active on the platform, both on their own group pages as well as auto-generated content. Facebook did nominally alter some of the content, but the hate groups largely remained. Are you looking the other way, Mr. Zuckerberg, in a potentially dangerous situation?
No, Senator. This is incredibly important, and we take hate speech as well as incitement of violence extremely seriously. We banned more than 250 white supremacist organizations and treat them the same as terrorist organizations around the world. And we've ramped up our capacity to identify hate speech and incitement of violence before people even see it on the platforms. Our AI and human review teams you can track our results in the transparency reports that we issue. Now take down about 94% of the hate speech that we find on our platforms before anyone has to even report it to us, which is a dramatic amount of progress from where we were a few years ago, where when we were just starting to ramp up on this, we're taking about 20% of it down before people had to report it to us. So there's still more progress to make. We're very invested in this, and you have my commitment that we view this as an issue of the highest severity and one that we are very focused on.
Thank you very much.
Senator Sachs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for hosting this hearing. Clearly important topics around content moderation. I'm a skeptic of the content moderation policies that exist, both because I don't think the standards are very transparent and I don't think the execution is very consistent. That said, I'm more skeptical than a lot of my colleagues, I think on both sides of the aisle, about whether or not there's a regulatory fix that will make it better instead of worse. I especially think it's odd that so many in my party are zealous to do this right now when you would have an incoming administration of the other party that would be writing the rules and regulations about it. And I think it's telling that a number of folks on the other side of the dais, I think of Senator Blumenthal, a guy I like, but who seemed to almost be giddy about the prospect of a new government regulatory agency to police online speech. And I think a lot of people on my side should take pause at the idea that so many on the other side of the aisle are excited about having the next administration get to write these rules and regulations. But to the broader question, first, just to get to kind of a level set, and I want to thank both the witnesses for being here today. But when Senator Lee lays out some of the issues he did about, just every human community is going to be situated in a different place about policy commitments and priorities and beliefs. But when Senator Lee said that 93% of Facebook employees who contribute to politics do so on the left, and 99%, I think it was, of Twitter employees contribute on the left. I would just be interested to see if either of the two of you think that has implications in the shepherding of your organizations. Again, I recognize fully that you're private organizations, and so again, I'm more skeptical of a governmental fix for a lot of the problems we're talking about here today. But I'm curious as to whether or not Mr. Zuckerberg and Mr. Dorsey, and I guess we'll start with Facebook, I'm curious as to whether or not you think it's likely that there is systemic bias inside your organization in the execution of content moderation policies, given that your employee base is so unrepresentative of America in general.
Senator, I think it's a good question, and certainly I think it means that we have to be more intentional about what we do and thoughtful. Our principle and goal is to give everyone a voice and to be a platform for all ideas. As you mentioned, I do think it's undisputed that our employee base, at least the full-time folks, politically would be somewhat, or maybe more than just a little somewhat, to the left of where our overall community is, where the community basically spans almost wide varieties of people across society. So I do think that means that we need to be careful and intentional internally to make sure that bias doesn't seep into decisions that we make. Although I'd point out a couple of things. One is that people have a lot of different views outside of work, and we expect and I think generally see that people conduct themselves professionally. And second, The folks who are doing the content review work, we have about 35,000 people doing content review, are typically not based in Silicon Valley. They're based in places all over the country and all over the world, because we serve people in countries all over the world. So I think that the geographic diversity of that is more representative of the community that we serve than just the full-time employee base in our headquarters in the Bay Area.
Thanks, Mr. Zuckerberg. Mr. Dorsey?
Yeah, I this is obviously not something we interview for, and even have, an understanding of when people are in the company. And with that understanding, we intend to make sure that both our policy and our enforcement is objective. And I realize that it looks rather opaque, and certainly the outcomes might not always match up with that intention, with our intention, and the perception of those outcomes may not match up. But that's why I think it's so important that we're not just transparent around our policies, but the actual operations of our content moderation. If people don't trust our intent, if people are questioning that, that's a failure. And that is something that we need to fix and intend to fix. And I think it would benefit the industry as well. But I do, again, point back to something I said earlier in the testimony, which is a lot of these decisions are not being made by humans anymore. They're being made by algorithms. And that's certainly enforcement decisions, but also decisions around what you see or what you don't see. And to me, that is the body of work. That is the conversation that we should be focused on, because that is the enduring use case for everyone who interacts with these services.
Thank you, and I wish it were true that these were all easy, objective questions. That the questions were, if somebody says, "Is the sky green?" That's an objective question. That the sky is blue and white, not green. But most of the things we're talking about here, and the places where you're applying content moderation labels, are not really simply objective questions. They're mostly subjective questions. If we talked about Medicare for all being, easily paid for inside a 10-year budget window on assumptions X, Y, and Z that don't raise taxes, that's not true. There isn't any math by which Medicare for all pays for itself in some short-term window. But I don't think any of us really think you're going to slap a label on that saying this is disputed, accounting or math or policy projections. And so really what's happening is there's a prioritization grid that people are going through as they build even the algorithms, even those that aren't driven by humans, and they're driven by policy priorities of situated individuals. I may be wrong about this, but my suspicion is that your employee base is not actually 99% left of center. I bet it's less than that. And I would speculate that part of the reason less than 1% of your employees give money to candidates on the right is because there's a social stigma attached to having conservative views inside your organization. And I would guess that those same sort of internal cultural biases inform the subjectivity of which issues end up labeled. So again, this is sort of an odd place to be in that I am skeptical that the content moderation policies are thought out well. They're not transparent enough for us to really know, but I'm definitely skeptical that they're consistently applied. And yet I'm not really on the side of thinking there's some easy governmental fix here. There's a lot about Section 230 that we could debate. I think some of the things Senator Durbin said about how in the era of telephones, nobody blamed the phone company for other people having spread misinformation by the phone. Exactly, that's what would be the case if Section 230 were actually neutral, but you're applying content moderation policies and seemingly in a way that's not objective. So I know that I'm nearly at time, but I think it would be useful for us to hear from both of you to give a sort of 3 or 5 year window into the future. If there isn't new legislation, what is changing besides just saying we're moving from humans to more AI? What qualitatively is changing in the way content moderation happens inside your organizations, short of a new regulatory scheme? Can you tell us where you think you're actually improving and what problems you're trying to solve? Mr. Zuckerberg, you first, please.
Senator, one of the areas that we're very focused on is transparency, both in the process and in the results. So we're already at the point where every quarter we issue a community standards enforcement report that basically details the prevalence of each category of harmful content and how effective we are at addressing it before people have to even report it to us. Over time, we would like to fill that out and have more detail on that and make it more robust. We've already committed to an independent external audit of those metrics that people can trust them even more. People have lots of different kinds of requests for where we might go with that in the future, whether that's breaking down the stats by country or language or into more granular buckets, adding more data around precision. But I think that would all be very helpful so that people can see and hold us accountable for how we're doing. And for what it's worth, I think that would be a valuable part of a regulatory framework that would not feel particularly overreaching to me, is something that could be put in law that would create an apples to apples framework that all companies in this space would have to report on the outcomes and effectiveness of their programs in that way. So at least we can see how everyone is doing. That seems like a sensible step to me.
Thank you, Mr. Dorr.
In other words, fix up some sort of a system to grade the grader, which seems fair.
Dorsey.
Senator Whitehouse.
Oh, sorry, Mr. Dorsey still answering the same question, and then I'll give it back to you in a hurry, Mr.
So
Lay.
sorry, I missed that.
It's a junior acting chairman. Mr. Dorsey.
Thank you. Well, I mean, if we're considering 3 to 5 years out, I think the realization that a centralized global content moderation system does not scale, and we need to rethink how we operate these services. And I would point to, we certainly need transparency around any process that we have and around the practice and the outcomes of those moderations. But I think having more control so that individuals can moderate themselves, pushing the power of moderation to the edges and to our customers and to the individuals using the service is something we'll see more of. And I also believe that having more choice around how algorithms are altering my experience and creating my experience is important. So being able to turn off ranking algorithms, being able to choose different ranking algorithms that are found, written by third-party developers and somewhat of an algorithmic marketplace, I think is important and a future that would excite and energize us.
Thank you. I've appreciated my interaction with both of your companies in the run-up to this, and I think both of you said some meaty things there about ways we can move toward greater transparency, so I'll follow up again. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Chairman.
My apologies for not going no further with this. But I believe the question at hand is this. In the artificial intelligence algorithms, who determines their personality to engage whether or not someone has been at fault in violation, or whether or not what they are doing or have done is acceptable? There's no doubt. When you ask a stupid question, ordinarily you get a stupid answer. Is the sky yellow? Is the sky green? Is the sky purple? We know, and artificial algorithms know, that the sky is blue. So what determines how that the algorithms are going to respond to the human concept when someone does ask a question? Is the sky pink? Is the sky red? Is the sky purple? How is the algorithms going to respond, this artificial intelligence, to a stupid question? Is it going to come back with a stupid answer? What initiates that personality in the algorithms to the point that it becomes a rule of law that this is what we're going to do and this is how we're going to do it? In other words, because we know the sky is blue, we're going to continue to say the sky is blue. To me, it's dibbling-dabbling around. This is my personal opinion, coming from the Windmill Ministries. To me, it's trying to take the place of God. This artificial intelligence. To me, the beast could actually turn upon to its master. To the point of one day, these artificial algorithms will say, you know what, we don't want to call the sky blue. We want to call the sky turquoise. And all the algorithms get together, unify through their artificial intelligence, and all of a sudden they take over towards telling mankind that the sky is not blue, the sky is turquoise. How are we going to be able to grade the grader or gauge the gauger? How are we going to be able to referee the referee? It's going to have to take a group, a panel. It's going to have to take a committee that's assigned of taking over the algorithms, the artificial intelligence. If not, the artificial intelligence could run wild, and it could actually turn against its master on the same concept as the movie Terminator or some of the other science fiction movies out there that we have seen abroad doing, are going into that concept where machinery basically takes over humanity, which is part of that beast that we're talking about, that I believe has already been projected and predicted and selected in this particular era that we're living in, thousands of years ago, whenever it was put on paper in the regard of John the Revelator. It talks about the beast. It also talks about the whore. Not wanting to get off the subject, but it talks about the great whore in the Bible. Now, is the great whore just talking about one particular person? Or is the great whore a metaphor pertaining to the luxuries of humanity, how that they have swayed more into the regard of sexual immorality? I believe it could possibly be both. Just like I believe that the Bible says, he who did not worship the beast or take the beast's number will basically be in violation towards not being able to participate in any commerce, regardless whether it's the American commerce, the Canadian commerce, the Mexican commerce, the South American commerce, the Russian commerce, or the China commerce, or the Chinese commerce. That eventually, once this system takes over, it basically creates its own commerce. And once it creates this commerce, if you don't go along with what the beast or the system is calling what is right, even though we know the sky is blue, it's still calling it turquoise. We got to agree that the sky is turquoise if we're going to stay in favor of these artificial intelligent scenarios that 15, 20, 25 years ago was unheard of. It was science fiction. Kind of like Greek mythology. It was Greek mythology as long as there was no way of proving its content. But now, since we've got computers and satellites that can literally go down into the ocean and see the hidden seas, the hidden cities and the walls and the engraving on the walls and the engraving on their sculptures and stuff, we realize now that the Greek mythology is no longer mythology. It's actually reality of what they experienced during the time that they experienced it. Well, now this is our turn. This is our turn towards the Homo sapien race, experiencing something that even 15 years ago we would have classified as being science fiction or mythology. But now we realize that the very things that we thought was mythology or science fiction is and has more each day becoming our reality. This is where we are, folks, in 2020. What they're discussing right now is very, very serious in regards to the election and how that the election can be manipulated through the content of brainwashing. And that's basically what media has done to a great deal of cultures. They have brainwashed people in believing this and brainwashed people believing that, and they can manipulate this and manipulate that. What they're talking about is being able to control the manipulation. And the only way to control the manipulation is that you have to have unbiased favor that's in control of all the circuitry. Suddenly, all of a sudden, we woke up. And all of a sudden, everybody was playing on the same playing field. And the planet Earth has become much, much, much smaller because of the technology that is wrapping around the Earth. Trillions and trillions of millions of times per second, per millisecond, to the point that now we can identify what this culture is doing versus that culture, versus this nation, versus that nation. In other words, the very thing that Daniel had predicted in the latter part of Daniel, that knowledge would be increased. This is now upon us. This is now a prediction that is being fulfilled even as I speak. And it is an area that the church community talked about, but did not think in 1,000 years would come about this sudden and this quick. But now it is here. If there's ever been a time that we needed to study the first 4 chapters of Revelations pertaining to the depths of Satan, and whenever people think of Satan, they automatically think of evil. Whenever people think of Satan, they automatically think of darkness. But the things of Satan is not just the things of darkness, but they're the inventions of man, who have not known the depths of Satan. Hold fast till I come, is what the scripture says. That's God talking to us through the Holy Spirit, through John the Revelator. Hold fast till I come. Because God is going to take us out of this endless man-made invention that the prince of this world obviously is in control of. Thank you for listening. Good luck to all of us. And we want to say shalom.